brave soul who fears not death. I shall guide you, so that you may lull the old one back to slumber.
Welcome to the first episode of the Demon's Souls miniature scratch building series. Demon's Souls has been horribly underrepresented in the merch department. There's plenty of Dark Souls stuff, and even a whole board game, but nothing for Demon's Souls. So, in this series, I'm going to fix that. The first boss on the list is going to be the tutorial boss, Vanguard. We're going to start off with scaling him. This is a stand-in fluted knight that I made on Hero Forge. This lad will be the absolute unit to which all the other bosses are scaled to. This right here is a 3-inch wooden disc, which should be plenty big enough for Vanguard's base. I start off by roughly sketching out a Vanguard on an index card, which really scrambles my auto brightness here. I then begin to assemble the inner skeleton with some wire. I used paper clips and super glue because I didn't have any actual thick wire. This later came to bite me in the ass a little bit, so take it from me, just use some proper wire. As for the armature's pose, I want to give him a wide, imposing stance to properly match that first boss energy he's so full of. After the pose is roughed out, I used aluminum foil to bulk up the skeleton and begin the basic shapes of his body. Gel super glue keeps the foil in place pretty securely, so I opt to just kind of drown him in it for assembly. So here's the rough shape of Vanguard, and he's looking a little, small, so I decided to make a taller version, which looks much more appropriate, as the in-game character only stands up to about the height of Vanguard's tail or waist. Now, the majority of the model is going to use the rest of that Sculpey I bought for a past scratch build. If you don't know, Sculpey is a really nice crafting clay that stays workable until you bake it in the oven. That means I don't need to have a lot of sculpting experience. I can kind of take my time and do multiple revisions of a body part before finalizing it in the oven. However, the skeleton is currently just paper clips, foil, and super glue. It's not as sturdy as I had wanted it. In hindsight, I would have reinforced the skeleton more before working with the Sculpey. The Sculpey is not as rock hard as something like Milliput or green stuff. That means while sculpting, the armature had a tendency to shift and rock around, which would cause the Sculpey on top to crack. If you're going to do a sculpt like this, use thicker wire inside and give the armature a layer of Milliput or green stuff to really make it sturdy before you start building important bits on top of it. But before we even get into the sculpting, I want to really get some details right on Vanguard. Doing this in-game is kind of hard because, you know. So, here's a nifty program I found called Dark Souls Model Viewer DX. Despite the name, it actually does work for Demon's Souls and even Bloodborne to boot. This will allow us to open the game files and peek at whatever part of the Vanguard model we want, without, the horrible agonizing death. If you're curious, Vanguard's character model inside the code is C1030. Also, if you're like me and had a problem on initial startup, where every model was just kind of this ominous black blob, disable the global lighting. It should fix it right out. With the model at the ready for reference, I decided to start at the legs. I got these clay shaping tools for this project, and they were about $10 on Amazon. They're dual-ended, one side being these little round metal balls, and one side being like various shapes of silicone for shaping clay. To form the shape that I want, I just stick some Sculpey onto the model and use the silicone end dipped in a little water to massage the clay into place and kind of smooth it out. Not only does this help individual pieces blend together into a single creature, pressing the clay will help it adhere to the model so you don't have an ass cheek falling off mid-battle or something. As for the legs, I decided to work from the bottom up, starting with the legs and feet to give them a solid base for stability. I use Sculpey to first build up the general form, and smaller balls of clay when it comes to details like toes and joints. Vanguard is a creature with a lot of physical strength hidden under a very round form, so I make sure to keep him bulky, but not like Schwarzenegger shredded, you know? For all the claws, nails, and spike details all over his body, I utilized toothpicks and just carving them into whatever shape I needed. I was kind of hoping that the Sculpey itself would keep the toothpicks adhered after it baked, but a lot of the times the toothpicks just fell out. So for the toothpicks that I already had inserted, I took them out and re-glued them back in, and moving forward I glued them before even attaching to them, and everything worked out fine for the most part. After finishing his big fat belly, I decided to start on the upper torso and blend it down into the stomach. Vanguard's chest area is a bit on the flat side, which is kind of strange considering how strong he is. Nevertheless, I used the metal ends of these tools to carve the muscle definition in this time, as well as these little swirl-shaped recesses on the pecs. After the front of the torso is done, I move on to the arms and the upper back, first bulking up the general shape of the arm, baking it, then properly shaping on top of it when it's sufficiently buff enough. I also bulk up the shoulder and try to blend it in to where the neck would be. It's not perfect, but his horns will hide the majority of this area, so I'm not too worried. Now the hands were a bit of a challenge as I didn't quite know how to go about it. I decided to make another small armature out of paper clips, assembling it with gel super glue as well. I used this to make a nice hand with 5 fingers, watching the spacing of the fingers first, cementing everything in, then later trimming down the individual fingers to the appropriate length. Only after that do I realize that he only has 4 fingers, so
Oh fuck, I can't believe you've done this.
I used some foil to bulk out this shape as well and glue it to the wrist with super glue. With it glued on, now I can just hold the model to sculpt and not struggle with holding a tiny little hand. For the right hand in particular, I make the same kind of armature with the correct amount of fingers and wrap it around a wooden dowel that I'll be using as the axe handle. I wrapped it in foil to be able to remove it if I needed, but in hindsight I didn't really need to do this, so. Now the inner arm joint of the right arm really fell victim to not having a sturdy skeleton. It moved so much, the Sculpey around it broke like 4 times in total. Eventually I accidentally broke a bigger chunk off and just kinda ended up sealing most of it in with gel super glue and then covering up the injury like nothing ever happened. Just goes to show you how much trouble you can save yourself down the line by a little extra work at the start of the project. Or, you know, actually having proper wire and not looking at a bundle of paper clips and saying, it's good enough. Here I decided to bulk up the older shoulder as well, but I didn't realize at the time, but Vanguard's shoulders are actually kind of dinky. My Vanguard is, as they say, fucking jacked. He's got that natty Variasuit physique, you know? Regardless, I'm not doing it over, so my Vanguard's just gonna have that 99 strength build for now. Here I start on the head, the base of it all being a ball of Sculpey built around a paperclip. I start with the lower jaw and use toothpicks to give him a wicked underbite. Afterwards, I use more toothpicks to form every dentist's worst nightmare, laying a clay sausage over it when it's finished to form the upper lip. I press divots into the head to form the face and the eye sockets and use more small foil armatures to sculpt both the horns. Remember, with Sculpey, you can make minimum shapes required for progression, bake it, and then build off of it as you go, which is really nice if you're an amateur sculptor like me. Nothing's permanent until you stick it in the oven, and even then, if you're desperate, you can cut it off if you really messed up. After I finish the head, I trim the paperclip and attach it to the top of the torso with some super glue. The super glue joined to hold it while I bulk up the neck with more clay. I also bulk up and form more of the back of the torso to give him some more chunk. Now the wings were a bit of a challenge going into it, but I decided to tackle it like the hands, making a small armature with paper clips and building off of that, taking sure not to bulk up the wing membranes too much or it's going to look kind of weird. I sculpted one side at a time, baked it, flipped it over, and did the other side, as to avoid smushing my previous work. Here I attach the wings, but that stability issue comes up again. Here I should have kept the paperclip even longer and drilled a deeper hole to insert it into. It would have made the wing connection much more sturdy, but as it is right now, it caused a small crack down the line of one of the wings. It just rocked around too much. After adding a piece of paperclip for the larger back spike, I began to bulk up the upper back in general, making sure to give the wings a full connection all around to the model and sculpting on the rest of the back spike spine things before baking it for the final time. You'll also notice that I added a green tube over the axe shaft, an old reusable straw that was just a little too small to slide over it nicely. What I chose to do is cut it up to open the tube and glue it on and use some glue to seal the gap closed and sand it flush. Now I take some styrene plastic sheeting that I glued 2 different thicknesses together to make one really thick piece, and hold it up to the axe. I roughly draw out the shape of the axe head and use my clippers to cut out the general shape. From there I use a little rubbing alcohol and wipe off the first guidelines and draw on the new guidelines for the blade edge. I begin to remove a lot of material from the blade area with my X-Acto knife, and as I do, I notice that I really like the jagged, damaged appearance that I accidentally made. Instead of making a nice, smooth axe head, I do the other side like this as well, producing a really old and worn-looking great axe blade. To finish off the axe, I use another thick piece of styrene to craft the back side of the axe, and part of the dowel that I used for the handle that was left over just stuck to the top after running it through a pencil sharpener. And now for the base. I first removed Vanguard by breaking the superglue anchors I had used on the underside of the pins. Because it was almost 6 AM and I really didn't feel like getting up to turn on the oven again, I covered the base with Milliput, using some disposable gloves, because I really hate trying to wash that shit off my hands. Besides, this is the base, and it's going to get handled more often, so I don't mind using a harder material like Milliput here. Whenever I do these bases, I want them to be consistent across each of the 5 worlds in the game, so for all the bosses of the Boletaria Palace, I'm going to form the majority of it with this cobblestone brick texture roller I got from Green Stuff World like a million years ago, some shit. I ended up not mixing enough Milliput for the whole base, so what I decided to do was to fill in any gaps I had missed with my basing material, clay cat litter, and some sand. This will give it a nice, battle-worn and neglected appearance instead of it just kind of looking bland and uniform. So before I talk paint, let's talk primer. When I spray primed Vanguard, the coat of primer ended up not curing properly on the sculpting. It was sticky to the touch for like 3 hours after I had the initial spray down, and it's not the brand nor the can. I've used this before, the exact same can before. While I was sitting there examining it, I, for some reason, remembered a completely unrelated video about quickly filling in the layer lines of FDM 3D prints with paint and a quick clear coat. So, kind of experimenting, I hit Vanguard with a cheap matte varnish. For some reason this worked, although it left a small crackle texture on the model, which kind of works out. I kind of like it. I don't know why anything in this chain of effects occurred as it did, but just keep this in mind if you try to spray prime your Sculpey models. I'll leave that video I'm talking about in the description as well. But yeah, paint. I start off with a heavy overbrush of a dark gray on the model and the base, avoiding the recesses. Then I swap to a lighter, more neutral gray, overbrushing but not covering up the previous layer entirely. After that, I swap to a much lighter gray, but this time it was sponged on to give a nice skin texture of sorts. I mean, it's pretty easy. Get paint on the sponge, dab off a lot of it all, then stab at the model. Pretty simple, but when it comes to sponging, it's pretty easy to go overboard or not take enough paint off your sponge. I also apply these neutral and lighter grays to the base as well, but instead of sponging, I use a light dry brush or overbrush. I mix gray and brown and dab on some of that color to the shoulder and the wing areas to give them some differentiation. For the axe and all the metal on that, it was all sponge work as well, with progressively lighter coverage, taking care not to completely cover up the layers underneath. I started with a dark silver, then a brown, then a texture paint, Typhus Corrosion from Citadel, then finally a bright silver. Altogether, I think it really gives an ancient, corroded feel to Vanguard's mighty axe. Now the next step is to completely fuck up the model. Here I had applied Games Workshop's Nuln Oil all over, but after I did, it just came out way too dark. I also forgot that I painted it in grayscale, so when I applied the brown tone wash that I wanted to, which was Agrax Earthshade, it would tint it all and make Vanguard the light brown color he is. I tried to salvage it by sponging on some more of the original colors, and yeah, looking at it, I think it was a decent save. I also decided to keep the gray color scheme. While he looks very brown in-game, I noticed that a lot of it just boils down to the lighting in his little boss chamber. If you look at the model with no lighting in Dark Souls model viewer, he's fairly gray, well, pale, or, you know, well, so I went with that, you know, just leaving some areas of his body brownish as on the original model. Having gray and brown instead of just one helps make the model a little less monotone in my eyes. Plus, at this point, I've been working on this project for way too fucking long, so I was kind of ready to be done with it. And the final touches, pure white for the eyes, followed by my favorite yet completely extinct yellow glaze, Lamenter's Yellow. Leave it to the Lamenters to get canned once again. I pick on these guys a lot, but I really do love them. But anyways, a thin coat of contrast yellow would also work for this fairly low-tech caveman eye glow, but I didn't have any. And with that, Vanguard is complete. Well, it's the end of the video, and I honestly never write scripts for this part. I mean, I like how it came out. The whole project took like 3 weeks on and off. I was just really busy in life and just kind of, I don't know, didn't have a lot of energy, I guess. For a while, it was, you know, wake up, immediately go to work, come back, and didn't feel like I've got much progress day by day, but you know, little by little, he got to where he needed to be. I completely blew over any chance of a Halloween video, but that's fine. I knew I was going to be busy with this, and I didn't want to try to pressure myself to whip up something for that. I learned a lot during the project. I learned how brittle Sculpey can be. I definitely next time need to make a more solid inner skeleton. I did it for my scratch build for my hand snake boy Dexter, but I didn't do it here because I forgot, because I'm an idiot. Regardless, I'm happy with how he came out. He's certainly not perfect, and you know, he hits the protein powder a little hard, but he's recognizable at the very least. Next up is going to be Phalanx, which shouldn't take nearly as much time as this. I've got all the materials ready to go, I got a game plan, so I hope you stick around to see what I can cook up. Until next time, may the heavens gaze favorably upon you. Umbasa.